Wyoming Territory, 1884. Sunset bled along the ridgeline and slipped into the street like a last warning nobody heard. In the Red Rock Saloon, the piano was playing something cheerful to keep the shadows from crowding in, and the bartender was pouring whiskey like it had a job to do. Spilled beer carried the smell of old wood and saddle leather. Dice knocked against a tin cup. Laughter came in quick bursts, like coyotes yapping at the edge of a campfire. Elias Mercer sat alone at a corner table, a plain tin cup in his hand, dust on his boots thick as salt. His hat brim rode low, hiding most of his face. He might have been any drifter who'd moved through the high country all summer, panning creeks, sleeping under the cold-stitch quilt of stars. He might have been any lonely traveler, if not for one small detail. He sat as if he'd been carved there, still and steady, like a fence post that had seen 20 winters and wasn't about to lean for anyone. Folks knew him as a prospector, quiet, kept to himself, paid cash for flour and beans, a pinch of coffee when he could spare it. Always polite, never cruel, never curious. He had a way of listening without moving that made men talk less and think more. If he asked anything, it was about weather, trails, the price of nails. Nothing that carried heat. Tonight, the heat came to him. Kane Durgan pushed through the batwings with 2 of his boys in tow. Boots loud, spurs louder. He had the swagger of a man who'd never been made to pay full price for his mistakes. The piano's song thinned when he entered, like it didn't want to be heard by him. He wore a smile sharp enough to cut a man's cheek without touching skin. Folks always said Kane made trouble the way wind made dust, naturally, without thinking. There he is, Kane said, nodding toward the corner. The ghost that haunts our little town without so much as a how-do. The bigger of his boys, a bull-neck stub named Pike, laughed and smacked his palm on the bar. Quiet as a grave, that one, he said. Maybe he forgot his tongue up in them hills. Elias lifted the tin cup and drank, polite as ever. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. His gaze stuck on the steam clinging to the kerosene lamp glass, on how it thinned and vanished. He set the cup down soft. No sound from him but the small ring of metal on wood. "You hear me, Pilgrim?" Kane asked. His boots scuffed across the floor in a slow arc were being sociable. "Say something. Tip your hat. Whistle a hymn. Don't make him feel like he's talking to a fence." The bartender's hands went still on a glass. One of the card players folded his hand without even looking at his cards. The piano played on, hesitant, uncertain, then faltered into silence. "Leave it, Kane," someone muttered. "He don't bother nobody." "That right?" Kane stopped by Elias' table, shadow falling across it. "Bothers me. Sits there like he thinks he's better. Real men talk. Real men drink. Real men laugh when they're spoken to." Pike took it upon himself to be helpful. He set his boot against Elias' chair leg and shoved. The chair skidded an inch. Elias' hand stayed flat on the table, palm down, steadying nothing. He didn't spill a drop. Pike frowned, then shoved harder. The chair moved again. Elias' body moved with it, like a rock rolling a little under spring water, heavy, unbothered. "Look at that," Kane said, smiling brighter. "He's a turtle in his shell." One of the other boys, thin and mean, pinched Elias at brim and flicked it up, wanting eyes. He found them, gray, clear, old as a long winter. Elias' gaze rose just enough to be seen. The boy's fingers twitched. He let the hat fall back down. "You ain't men enough to raise your eyes," Kane said, leaning in, breath sweet with cheap whiskey. "You ain't men enough to say your name." Elias' voice came quiet, barely more than the soft draw of a match. "Careful, son. You're reaching for death with a shaky hand." The room changed temperature. Something left the air, maybe laughter, maybe the safe feeling that the night would pass like other nights. A woman near the piano caught her breath. The bartender set his glass down and stepped back, as if the bar itself might jump. Kane blinked once, twice. "Now there's a word," he said. "Death. That what you carry around in that tin cup?" Elias gave a small shake of his head. "Coffee. Coffee," Kane repeated, and laughed. "Hear that? The ghost drinks coffee. You a preacher under all that dust." Elias said nothing. "You think you're better than me?" The smile had edges now. "Ain't no man better than me in this room. Not a one. Ask around." Nobody did. Nobody had to. Kane was quick with a gun and quicker with temper. He'd broken a man's jaw with a bottle last spring for talking up the wrong girl. He'd fired at a dog to scare a boy. He'd laughed both times. Pike set a meaty hand on Elias' shoulder and squeezed, waiting for flinch or plea. He got neither. The chair legs creaked but held. Elias' hand, still palm down on the table, never tightened, never balled into a fist. The stillness wasn't the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of a loaded wagon at the top of a hill. "Stand up," Kane said. "Let's get a look at what kind of man hides under that hat." Elias looked at the lamp again, the steam thinning on the glass, how it gave way and disappeared. He rose slowly, without scrape or hurry, as if the room moved with him. He was taller than most had guessed, not broad but strong with the kind of strength you get when you've packed your life on your back and walked it through 100 miles of wind. The dust of travel dimmed the lines of his coat. The coat dimmed the shape of everything else. "Name," Kane said. "Elias Mercer." Pike snorted. "That a name or a cough?" "It'll do," Elias said. Kane cocked his head. "Mercer," he said, tasting it. "Don't know it." "That seems fine by me," Elias said softly. The words weren't loud, but they hit like iron laid on a forge. "What's your work?" Kane asked. "Ground," Elias said. "I listen to it. If it gives, I dig. If it holds, I move on." "Look at that," the thin one sneered. "He's a poet." "Poetry bores me," Elias said. "And so does this." Pike's hand tightened on his shoulder, fingers digging for a nerve. Elias' eyes didn't leave Kane's. Pike's features pinched a little, confusion creeping in. Most men winced at pressure. Elias didn't. "Say, that's something," Kane murmured. "You got a backbone." "Good." He leaned closer, breathing sky-high confidence. "But bones break." The bartender tried again. "Kane," he said, voice quiet. "Let the moon be. You telling me how to spend my evening?" Kane didn't turn. "Sit tight. I'm teaching our stranger manners." Elias looked away from Kane, just for a moment, past him, through the saloon doors, to the street where dusk had gathered in the ruts like shallow water. A kid trotted by with 2 buckets. A woman with a shawl hurried home. The whole town seemed to lean toward the saloon, listening. "Talk," Kane said. "Say, sir." "Say, Kane." "Say, I'm sorry." Elias frowned at that last one like it didn't belong to him. "I won't lie," he said. "You're a slow learner," Kane said. "Boys, help him along." Pike shoved Elias hard. The chair went over, clattered. The room flinched with it. Elias staggered a fraction and then was right again, steady as a stake set deep. The boy with the thin face flicked his hat brim again, bolder this time. Elias took his hat off and set it on the table. His hair was iron gray at the temples, as if a storm had left frost on him and moved on. "You think you're tough," Kane said. His smile had gone thin as wire. "You ain't. You're a rock in the road. I can kick you off it or I can blast you. Either way, you move." A card player couldn't hold it in. "Kane," he said, voice barely there. "You don't want this." "Mind your game," Kane snapped. Then, to Elias, "Last chance." Elias' gaze was steady, not proud, not bowing. "I don't want trouble." "You got it anyway." The night after the saloon standoff settled over Red Rock like a blanket soaked in old ghosts. Lamps dimmed one by one, doors latched, shutters drew closed with a quiet that spoke of men not sure what they'd just seen, and more afraid of what they hadn't. Kane Durgan hadn't pulled the trigger. That much folks knew. But it wasn't mercy that stopped him. It was something in Elias Mercer's stillness, in the way he didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't breathe heavy like men are supposed to when death gets close. Sheriff Holden had been leaning near the back wall of the saloon when it all went down, arms crossed, badge dull with dust and time. He'd seen a lot over 20 years of Warrington in a lawless land, but there was something about Elias that dug deep under his skin and stayed. After Kane holstered his gun and stalked off, face twitching with something he couldn't name, the sheriff didn't say a word. He just watched Elias as the men adjusted his hat, lifted his tin cup, finished the last sip of his cold coffee, and walked out like nothing had happened. That bothered Holden more than anything. Outside, the wind stirred loose grit through the darkened street, tugging Elias' coat hem as he passed the livery, the general store, and finally rounded the corner toward the miners' boarding house, where he'd rented a room for 2 weeks without ever using the bed. The townsfolk watched him from cracked windows and behind slitted curtains, their whispers like dry leaves skittering across the floor. "That man's death in boots," someone muttered. "He didn't draw," said another. He didn't have to, came the reply. Sheriff Holden stood outside the saloon a moment longer, staring into the dark like he was trying to remember something he'd never learned. He spat once, then murmured to no one, "I've seen killers. That man's eyes, they ain't empty. They're resting." At the boarding house, Elias sat by the window and watched the moon cast silver down over the rooftops. He didn't light a lamp. He never did. Light invited memory. Darkness, at least, was honest. His hat lay on the table, brim still dusted with trail silt. His coat hung from the back of a chair. He sat in his undershirt, sleeves rolled, arms lean but strong, built for pulling gold from rock or drawing iron in a breath. There was a knock. Gentle. Too light for a man. He didn't move at first. Just listened. Another knock, a little firmer. He opened the door to find a boy no older than 9 standing barefoot on the wood, face shadowed beneath an oversized hat. "You that man from the saloon?" the boy asked. Elias nodded once. "You let that feller talk to you like you were dirt," the boy said. "Why?" Elias leaned in the doorway. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy said. "My pa got shot last year by a mun like that cane. Talk big. Shot faster." Elias studied the boy's face. Too much hardness there for 9. "Where's your ma?" "Upstairs," Tommy said. "Sewing until her fingers bleed, just to keep us fed." Elias exhaled slow. "You think I should have killed him?" Tommy looked down. "I think men like him only stop when someone makes him." Elias stepped out, crouched before the boy. His voice was low. "You know what happens when you draw too often, son." Tommy shook his head. "One day, your hand's faster than your mind. One day, the gun decides who you are." He looked off toward the canyon rim. "One day, you put a min in the ground and lose a piece of yourself you don't ever get back." Tommy's jaw tensed, unsure how to argue with that. "But he'll come after you." "I know. You ain't afraid." "I've been afraid," Elias said. "But fear's not what keeps a mun from drawing. Regret is." Tommy's eyes glinted with something between understanding and sorrow. Elias put a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Go on. Your ma needs you." As the boy turned and padded off into the dark, Elias stood there for a moment longer, watching the stars turn. Then he went back inside and shut the door. In the canyon beyond the edge of town, Cain Durgan sat by a fire, his jaw clenched, staring into the flames like they owed him answers. Pike spit into the dirt. The thin one, Jeb, poked at the fire with a stick, restless. "He made you look small," Pike said. "Real small." Cain didn't answer. "You should have pulled," Jeb added. "You had the drop." Cain finally looked up. "You saw his eyes." Pike blinked. "What about him?" They weren't scared. They weren't even mad. Cain leaned forward. They were waiting, like he'd been through this dance 100 times and knew every damn step. "Old man bluffin'," Jeb muttered. Cain smiled, slow and cruel. "You ever hear the name Iron Hand?" Pike frowned. "That a mine?" Cain shook his head. "Used to be a man. Gunfighter. Fast as damn draw north of the Rio Grande. They said he once shot the spurs off a man's boots without touching his legs." Jeb laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Folk tales." "Maybe," Cain said. "But that fella in the saloon? I think I seen his face before. Years back. Poster didn't say Elias. It said Mercer." Pike whistled low. "You saying he's that Mercer?" Cain didn't blink. "He disappeared after the Widow Gulch massacre. Took out 5 men with 6 bullets. The 6th one hit his own brother." Silence crept in. Even the fire crackled quieter. "What's he doing here?" Jeb asked. Cain stood, face like stone. "Don't matter. He's breathing. That's enough." Pike frowned. "We going after him?" Cain smiled again, that dead smile. "Oh, we ain't doing nothing here. We wait. Follow him out when he rides. A mun like that, he don't hide. He wanders. And when he does, we finish what we started." Back in town, Sheriff Holden lit a lantern at his office and pulled an old ledger from a drawer. He flipped through names, not sure what he was looking for, but knowing his gut didn't lie. He remembered a time, years ago, when a bounty hunter brought in a photo of a younger man, eyes like winter fog, right hand burned and leathered from fire, hair black as a coal vein. Iron Hand Mercer. Sheriff had laughed then. "Ain't no man that fast." Now he wasn't laughing. He looked out the window toward the miners' boarding house. No light there, of course. The men didn't seem to sleep. Didn't seem to do anything but breathe and wait. Elias sat by the window again, tin cup in hand. No coffee in it now. Just the smell of rust and ghosts. He rubbed his thumb along the edge, feeling the worn groove left by years of calluses. He hadn't held a gun in 8 years. Hadn't spoken that name in 10. But it followed him like smoke from a long-dead fire, curling into every town, every whisper, every young fool eager to test his legend. He'd buried his guns in a canyon south of El Paso. Swore never to dig them up. Swore on the grave of the man he'd killed by accident, the one who'd called him brother. Now Kane Durgan had stirred the dust again. And dust, Elias knew, never stayed down for long. Beyond the edge of Red Rock, the canyon waited. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. And 3 men watched the night, waiting for one quiet man to ride. They didn't know what waited inside him. But soon, they would. The morning broke cold and pale, spilling a gray light across the canyon like a sheet drawn over a corpse. Elias Mercer rode alone, rein slack in one hand, his mare moving slow and deliberate down the winding trail. Red Rock was shrinking behind him. He hadn't said goodbye. He never did. Goodbyes had weight, and Elias carried enough already. The canyon yawned open before him, sheer walls on either side, sandstone glowing faintly beneath the winter sky. Snow patches clung to the shadows, untouched by sun or boot. It was a place the wind spoke clearly, where a man could hear every lie he ever told himself. Hoofbeats echoed wrong. Elias stopped. His mare froze too, ears twitching. He didn't reach for his side. Just listened. The silence that followed was too careful, too measured. He spoke without raising his voice. You ain't near as quiet as you think. A laugh bounced down the rock face. Then Kane Durgan stepped out from behind a boulder, gun resting loose in one hand. 2 more figures moved into view behind him, Pike with a club in hand, Jeb already grinning like a dog let off leash. Morning, Mercer, Kane said. Thought we'd walk you to the border. Elias didn't blink. Trail's crowded. Yeah, we noticed. Kane took a step closer. Townfolk might be scared of you. Might think you're some legend with a dusty name. But me. He cocked his head. I think you're just a tired old man with slow hands. Elias looked past him at the canyon walls. You picked a poor place for dying. Kane laughed again. We ain't the ones dying today. Elias let the reins go. His mare stepped aside, sensing something old and sour in the air. I told you in the saloon, Elias said, voice low as the wind. I don't want trouble. That's so. Kane's smile cracked. Then you should to look me in the eyes. The canyon went still. Pike surged forward first, raising the club high. Elias moved, fast and sharp, quicker than the eye could follow. His boot slid out, catching Pike's ankle. The big man toppled like a dropped tree, the club thudding into dust. Elias grabbed Pike's wrist mid-fall and twisted, one clean motion, and a sickening crack split the air. Pike screamed, the sound bouncing off the walls. Before Jeb could react, Elias was on him. He didn't draw. He didn't need to. One step, a pivot, and Jeb's revolver was ripped from his holster, twisted from his grip with brutal precision. Elias slammed the barrel down on Jeb's shoulder, and the men crumpled with a grunt, his weapon clattering to the ground useless. Kane hadn't moved. He stared, jaw tight, breathing hard. You're fast, he muttered. Elias stood over the fallen men. His eyes were clear, cold, not angry, just tired. I warned you, he said. Kane raised his pistol. Then let's see if you warn faster than I shoot. The hammer cocked back. Elias moved. His hand dipped to his side, where the revolver rode snug under his coat. Old leather, familiar weight. The gun cleared the holster with a sound like history repeating itself. One shot. Jeb's hand twitched. The bullet hit the ground by his fingers. Not killing, warning. 2 steps. Pike tried to roll. Another shot struck the dirt an inch from his ribs. He froze. Kane blinked, heart thudding at his chest. His pistol wavered. Elias kept walking. Steady. Measured. Don't, Kane growled. Elias stopped 10 feet from him. I don't aim to kill men anymore, he said, his voice a rasp cut with gravel and regret. But if you force my hand, I don't miss. Kane fired. The bullet screamed through the canyon. Elias moved once. His revolver barked twice. Kane's shot went wide, scarring Rock. His own gun flew from his hand, struck by Elias' first bullet. The second buried itself in Kane's coat, just above the shoulder, enough to knock him off his feet, not enough to end him. He hit the ground hard, groaning, arm limp at his side. Elias stood over him. The smoke cleared slow. All around, the canyon echoed with the sound of violence just ended. Jeb whimpered. Pike coughed blood. Kane's face twisted with rage and pain. You, he hissed. You could have killed me. I still could, Elias said. Kane spat. Then why don't you? Elias holstered his weapon. Because I remember what it cost me last time. Kane's eyes filled with fury. I'll come for you, he spat. I swear it, Mercer. I'll bleed this canyon with your name. Elias looked at him a long moment, then turned and began walking toward his horse. Kane screamed after him. You hear me, you son of a... I'll ride through Red Rock. I'll burn your name off every wall. You're dead, Mercer. You're already dead. Elias paused, turned slightly. His face was carved from wind and stone. No, he said softly. But you might be. Then he mounted up and rode away, his figure swallowed by dust and silence, the canyon echoing with the ghosts of gunfire and a vengeance yet to come. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and broken pride down from the canyon, curling into red rock like an omen. Kane Durgan hadn't died, but his scream had echoed long enough to make folks believe he had. What truly terrified them was that Elias Mercer had let him live. Mercy from a man like that, quiet, carved from dust and silence, was more terrifying than death. It meant he chose not to kill. It meant he could have, and likely would again have crossed. But Kane wasn't the kind of man to crawl off licking wounds. He was the kind that bled hate into the dirt and expected the land to repay him in blood. And so he rode out. By the next dusk, Kane had vanished into the hill country, and word began to crawl through the brush like a coiled snake. Smoke rose from outlaw camps that hadn't burned in months. Faded names rode back into relevance, men who'd once been chased across state lines, now answering the call of a man furious enough to promise a town in ashes. They came in twos and threes, ghosts of old gangs, drifters with debts to settle and grudges to feed. Kane offered them something simple, one quiet man and a town too soft to protect itself. A score to settle. A name to bury. And if the town got in the way, all the better. Red Rock felt it before they saw it. Horses rode past fences too slow to be cowhands. Doors stayed shut longer. Guns started appearing on hips that had gone years without needing them. The piano in the saloon played slower, softer, and stopped altogether when the sun went down. The children didn't laugh outside anymore. They whispered the name Iron Hand like it was a sin. Sheriff Holden watched the change settle in like a slow fever. He stewed longer on porches, paced the length of Main Street until the boards remembered his steps. Every morning, he looked to the East Ridge, scanning for dust trails. Elias spent his days in silence. He had moved into the barn behind the boarding house, away from the rooms and curious eyes. His mare grazed in the paddock. He took no meals in town, asked for nothing, answered even less. At night, the sound of metal came from behind the doors, the kind of sound that made old men restless in their beds. Oil on steel. Wood against whetstone. A past unfolding in pieces. Still, he hadn't strapped on the guns. Not yet. It was the widow who knocked this time. Her name was Mabel, and she had worn black since spring. Her husband died in a mine shaft cave-in that half the town knew had been Kane's doing, but no one had dared say aloud. Elias opened the barn door and blinked into the sunlight, surprised. She stood there, hands clutched in front of her, eyes steady. I know what you are, she said. I'm not that anymore, Elias replied. I don't care, she said. You're the only one they're scared of. He shook his head, stepping aside to avoid her gaze. You beat Kane, she said. Put his boys in the dust. He didn't forget that, and now he's bringing hell with him. You know it. We all know it. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, eyes heavy. You want me to kill them. I want you to stop them, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Before my boy ends up under a church pew while bullets tear through the walls. Before the whole town is smoke. Elias turned away. I buried that part of me, ma'am. She nodded slowly, tears welling. And we'll bury more, won't we? More sons, more fathers. Just so you don't have to dig it up. She left him in silence. The next visitor was Sheriff Holden. He found Elias sitting on a bale of hay, cleaning his saddle with hands too careful for a made of violence. "They're coming, you know," the sheriff said. "Ain't no maybe about it now." Elias said nothing. 10, maybe 12 of them. Some I recognize. Most I don't. Keynes pulled together something fierce. Elias looked up. "You want me to gun down a dozen men?" "I want you to stand, Mercer. That's all." Holden's voice cracked. "They're gonna come riding through that pass like fire through dry grass. Town can't stop him. I can't stop him. Only men who might is sitting in this barn waiting for ghosts." Elias wiped his hands, stood slowly. "You know what happens when I draw, Holden? It doesn't end. There's always one more. One more who wants to test the myth. One more fool who thinks a fast hand means you're untouchable. I don't kill clean, Sheriff. I kill for good." Holden stared at him a long moment. "Maybe it's time." That night, the wind shifted. Smoke carried through the pines before the fire even touched the edge of town. The first to see it was Tommy, the widow's son. He ran down the street shouting, bare feet pounding earth, pointing toward the sky. Flames licked the heavens. The Red Rock Church stood at the town's eastern edge, framed against the dark like a cross meant to burn. Its steeple caught first, then the roof, the old wooden beams bursting with sparks that rained down like judgment. Fire crackled through stained glass windows, sending holy light dancing into the dirt. Townsfolk ran with buckets and blankets, but it was no use. The fire was deliberate, fast, meant to be seen. Kane Durgan sat on horseback at the edge of town, framed by flame, a wide grin splitting his face as the heat shimmered around him. "If the quiet men won't fight," he shouted, voice carried on wind and smoke, "then Red Rock will burn." His men laughed behind him, dark silhouettes against a flickering sky. Inside the boarding house, the widow clutched her son tight, whispering prayers over his head. Sheriff Holden stood in the middle of Main Street, watching it all, helpless, ashamed, and angry. In the barn, Elias sat in the shadows, watching flame dance across the walls. He said nothing, but his hand reached slowly for the old leather case beneath the floorboards, the one that still remembered his name. The fire smoldered through the bones of the church long into the night. Ash drifted like snow over Red Rock, covering rooftops, windowsills, and the shoulders of silent men standing helpless in the dirt. Children cried softly. Mothers held them tighter. No hymns rose from the east edge of town, just a brittle crack of wood giving up its shape. Elias Mercer sat alone in the barn, staring at the flames from a distance, their reflection trembling in the lantern beside him. His coat hung behind him like the hide of something hunted. For hours, he hadn't moved. Not since the first bell cracked and the steeple fell. He had said nothing when Kane's voice carried through the smoke. He had made no gesture when the sheriff came, eyes burning with the need to act, to protect, to beg. Now, with the fire dying and the night quiet, Elias stood. His boots moved slow across the dirt floor, as if he'd aged 50 years in the silence. He walked to the corner stall, unused, boarded long ago. He knelt and scraped aside the hay, revealing the edge of a loose board. The groan of wood beneath his hand was the sound of time shifting. He pulled it up and reached into the dark earth. The box came out heavy, oak-stained with oil and memory, iron hinges rusted shut. He set it before him, sat back on his heels, and stared at it for a long time. He hadn't opened this box in 8 years. Not since the day he rode into the canyon south of El Paso, dug a grave not for a man but for a part of himself. Inside the box lay not just weapons, but sins. Choices. The men he swore never to be again. His hand hovered over the latch. When he flipped it, dust rose like a breath exhaled from the past. The lid creaked open. 2 Colt revolvers sat side by side, cradled in oilcloth. Iron-handled, steel barrels blackened from use. His mark etched just below the hammer, a single line, straight and true. The symbol that once sent men running. He lifted one. It fit his hand like a memory he couldn't shake. Cold, perfect, patient. He stood. Sheriff Holden waited outside the barn. No words. Just a quiet presence beneath the stars. When the doors opened and Elias stepped out, the sheriff saw what he already feared, and hoped. Elias held the Colts at his side, holsters slung low across his hips. The guns gleamed faint in the moonlight, but they weren't bright. They were worn, weathered, like the men who carried them. Yet something in his walk had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. Not swagger. Not pride. Just weight. Purpose. I buried these guns with the men I used to be, Elias said, his voice low but clear. But tonight, you'll see him ride again. Holden didn't speak. He only nodded. The town began to gather. One by one, doors creaked open. Faces peeked out. Someone whispered his name. Not Elias. Iron Hand. They said it with a hush, like saying it too loud might bring lightning. By midnight, the whole town stood on the main street. Women holding children. Old-timers in their long coats. The blacksmith with his hammer in hand. All of them watching the barn. All of them waiting. Elias didn't speak to them. He just walked to the center of the street and stood there, silent. Sheriff Holden stepped beside him. Then the widow. Then Tommy. A rancher brought a lantern and hung it high on a hook. It cast long shadows behind Elias. Kane's shadow wasn't there, not yet. But dawn was coming. Kane Durgan rode in just before the sun, his men flanking him like buzzards on a fence. They stayed at the edge of town, watching the people part around Elias like wheat around a plow. Kane dismounted, boots crunching ash as he stepped forward. His smile was gone. His face was hard with the truth he'd ridden with all night. I see you dusted off the legend, he said. Elias didn't move. Kane looked at the townsfolk. You really think this man's gonna save you? No one answered. Kane nodded. Then let's end it. Just you and me. The sheriff stepped forward. This don't need to be a duel. Kane's eyes never left Elias. It's not a duel. It's a reckoning. The townsfolk stepped back. Kane raised his hand, pointing down the main street. Sun comes up. We draw. Elias gave one small nod. The world narrowed. Kane turned and walked away, boots steady. Elias stood alone again, bathed in the slow breath of firelight and the first pale streak of dawn bleeding across the horizon. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. The wind paused. The people held their breath. An Iron Hand stepped forward into the light, both guns at his side, gleaming like the final word of a forgotten prayer.